Here is an introductory note written by Derek Macaulay, who is the former Chief Officer of the General Assembly. As you know, today's topic is Unitarians and toleration. He put together this worship material, which this service is based on, back in July 2013, which was the 2000th anniversary of the passing of the Unitarian Toleration Act, which is also known as the Unitarian Relief Act or the Trinity Act. Derek describes it as a significant event in the history of British Unitarianism and free Christianity. As we remember our freedom, it is timely to consider the freedom of others. The freedom we now take for granted does not exist for millions of people in many parts of the world. Let's use the memory of our history as a springboard to practical action to promote civil and religious freedom the world over. And I will now light our chalice. Martin Luther King once said, "The hope of the world is still in dedicated minorities. The trailblazers in human, academic, scientific and religious freedom have always been in the minority. As we gather together today, may it be as such a minority, dedicated to the cause of freedom for all the people of the world. May it be so." And we will now have our first reading, which Ben is going to give.
First reading, excerpt from With Heart and Mind by Reverend Eric Jones. It was the summer of 1963. Two of us set out along muddy lanes and the wet marshland on the mountainside high above the Aberdare and Merthyr Tydfil valleys. We were looking for a pile of stones which denoted the exact spot of the old Cwmuglo farmhouse, Valley of Coal, and the remains of a barn which acted as the dissenters' meeting house. Up to 40 people gathered for worship here in the 1650s, daring to defy the law of the land in order to be able to worship with freedom in a country where religious freedom and tolerance were not allowed. They met at the barn of Cwmuglo farmhouse, cleared the hay and straw before worship could begin, stood for the whole service, whilst their leaders kept watch on nearby vantage points in case the hand of the law came too close. The ruins are still there, the remains of the farmhouse and barn with untrimmed stones emerging from the undergrowth. Tom Lewis of Kevin Coyd wrote a history of the early dissenters of the area in 1947, and he describes the spot as a dingle of sylvan beauty, screened by a profusion of dense copses and tall, overhanging trees, where tradition states the nightingale sang. There was certainly a magic about the place, and the magic has remained with me ever since. The peace and tranquility high above two industrial valleys, where people gathered and dared to be different. From the early pioneers at Cwmuglo, several places of worship of different traditions have emerged, including Unitarian churches in both Aberdare and Merthyr Tydfil. I often wonder if we continue to appreciate the sacrifice of those pioneers and embrace the vision of those early dissenters. We may be in danger of forgetting about their determination and courage, letting go an integral part of our heritage. Reading from the Reverend Eric Jones.
Thank you very much, Ben. And now a prayer from Derek Macaulay. We are met together before the divine to commemorate the faith and witness of those who went before us in their devotion to civil and religious liberty. We remember their historic witness to our tradition of freedom and tolerance and recall their labours, not counting the cost, to establish the principles that we now take for granted. we honour those who, in past times, have given their lives or did not flinch from sacrifice or suffering for the sake of freedom of belief and of worship. We mark, with gratitude, the courage of those who, facing persecution, endeavoured to fashion our religious heritage and bring together our community of the free. At this special time of anniversary, we remember in particular the achievement of William Smith MP 200 years ago. We acknowledge that civil and religious liberty is not universal and pledge ourselves to work for such freedom the world over. May it be so. And we will now have our second reading. This is a reading about the background and impact of the Toleration Act written by Derek Macaulay, and Maurice is going to read it.
The Toleration Act of 1689, as amended by the Act for the Further Relief of Protestant dissented ministers and schoolmasters in 1779, provided for considerable relief from statutory penalties and disabilities. This relief was not extended to Unitarians because, by Section 17 of the Toleration Act, it was provided that neither this Act nor any clause, article, or thing herein contained shall extend or be construed to extend to any ease, benefit, or advantage to any person that shall deny in his preaching or writing the doctrine of the Blessed Trinity as it is declared in the 39 Articles of Religion. Unitarians were not given the benefits of the Toleration Act of 1689 and of the Act of 1779 until 1813. As Richard W. Davis states, except in Ireland, Unitarianism was now legal in the United Kingdom. The name could be used with impunity, which was probably the bill's most important practical effect. The immediate response of the Unitarians, a special general meeting of the subscribers to the Unitarian Fund, was held on the 20th of August 1813 at the King's Head Tavern in the Poultry, City of London, and resolved that we conceive it to be the right of every man, a right derived immediately from the Almighty Creator, to form his own religious opinions, to profess them amongst his neighbours and fellow creatures, and to act upon them in the exercise of divine worship. That in religious opinion, profession and worship, as held, avowed and observed in Great Britain, there is no interruption of the peace of civil society and no call for the interference of the magistrate, who cannot affect to tolerate without assuming authority to persecute. That as Unitarian Christians we had long felt the injustice of being excluded by positive statute from even that share of religious liberty which was allowed for the mass of Protestant dissenters, for which exclusion we humbly conceive no reason was to be found in our character and conduct as citizens, wherein we have never yielded and can never yield the superiority of any denomination or class of our country. That we trust the period is advancing and would willingly hasten its arrival, when not only Christians of every description, but also our countrymen at large, shall be alike free to profess and defend their opinions, and all equally partake in the civil rights of Britons. A special general meeting of the Unitarian Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge and the Practice of Virtue by the distribution of books was convened at the chapel in Essex Street on the 30th of July 1813, chaired by the Reverend Thomas Belsham. Having expressed their great satisfaction with the passage of the Act and offered their thanks to Parliament, they resolved that this society hail the present measure as an auspicious prelude to that happy day when all penal laws and political restrictions on religious grounds shall be forever abolished, when an invidious and limited toleration shall give way to universal religious liberty, and when all, without distinction, shall be entitled by law to the possession of those civil and political privileges which are the birthright of Britons. Background and impact of the Toleration Act by Derek McCall.
And now we will have a short meditation by Reverend Lewis Reed, followed by a short period of silence and some music. Meditation. Doer of things seen and unseen, remind us today that there will always be more questions than answers. Give us the will to grow and develop through both questions and answers. Let both our doing and our resting be the signs of our belief in an unseeing world. May it be so.
The meaning of tolerance. The Unitarian leaflet, A Faith Worth Thinking About, presents values that Unitarians share, including mutual respect and goodwill in personal relations, and constructive tolerance and openness towards the sincerely held beliefs of others. The next question in the survey explored Unitarian attitudes to tolerance. Participants were asked to tick one or more of the following options. It is an openness to new thoughts, new ideas, new people. It is a fierce determination to fight for the right of people to worship as they choose, so long as it doesn't harm anyone else. It is loving in spite of human imperfection, Joyce Grenfell. It means that we can believe whatever we like, so long as it makes sense to us. It is accepting that others do not share our beliefs, and that their beliefs are just as valid and important to them as ours are to us. It is not a word I would use. I would prefer to talk about understanding and welcoming and empathy. People generally tick more than one option, with 39% choosing openness to the new and accepting that others do not share our beliefs, either just those two or in combination with other options. The rest ticked a wide variety of permutations, but only a small number opted for each combination. Tolerance is related in the minds of many respondents to the issue of freedom of religious belief. It is recognised that it is often difficult to put into practice. Many respondents find value in a tolerant approach to the beliefs of others, but it is clear that it must have limits, specifically that Unitarians should not tolerate particular beliefs and behaviours which are harmful to others. Some dislike the word tolerance itself, suggesting that it has negative connotations. Tolerance is generally recognised as an important concept for Unitarians, but the extent of its adoption will vary from person to person and situation to situation. Tolerance, wrote one person, is much more difficult to put into practice than to state as a precept. Other respondents developed this approach. Tolerance is a very half-hearted, grudging type of acceptance which still seems like a vote against. But I am reduced to tolerance sometimes as better than nothing. Then there are situations where I would betray myself and many others if I didn't resist strongly and make my views very clear and obvious. Several emphasised that tolerance must have limits. Some argued that personal red-line judgments about behaviour needed to be drawn at some point, beyond which they would not tolerate the actions and ideas of others. One wrote, "The caveat is that we don't tolerate intolerance in others." Another added, "as long as it does not harm or instigate harm to others." A third stressed, "It is important to note that tolerance, like freedom, contains its own check, in that we can provide a tolerant space so long as we feel tolerated ourselves." the positive aspects of tolerance. Some were more constructive about the concept. One wrote, "I love the toleration bit. It means we cut people slack, even when we think their beliefs aren't right." Another echoed this, commenting, "Knowing that we cannot change others, but acknowledging that others need their beliefs." More positive interpretations of tolerance included the following: engaging with the other in a spirit of kindness, and listening without thinking of arguing, leading to understanding of different subjects. One respondent believed that it meant accepting that others or ourselves are at different stages of spirituality. The tensions and challenges of tolerance. One respondent commented, Wilbur refers, this is Earl Morse Wilbur, an American Unitarian minister, refers to generous tolerance, tolerance which is not cheap and not easy, but which is costly and difficult. Another commented, "I like the word religious tolerance because of the implied tension and challenge in it. It is sometimes difficult to be tolerant, but it's important, and in extreme conditions prevents loss of life." One person introduced the word caution. "We should inform ourselves so that we can question and, if necessary, oppose religious teachings and beliefs that cause harm to followers or others. People may be free to follow their beliefs, but do we have to let what is damaging pass unchallenged?" The issues with the word tolerance and suggestions for alternatives. Several participants took issue with the word tolerance itself. More than one suggested that it implied putting up with, rather than an active engagement with those who are different from us. Some found the word patronising or judgmental, or implying superiority. One person was more condemnatory, commenting, "I don't like the word tolerance. To me, it is wishy-washy. Liberals can use it to accept things that really shouldn't be accepted, for example, female genital mutilation." And a number of people pondered what a better word might be, for example, acceptance and respect were proposed as possible alternatives.
Thank you very much, Diana. So, as I think will perhaps be apparent, this service was put together with a little speed yesterday. I'm tempted to tell a short anecdote, which I'm going to actually, about the pizza of divine inspiration. It's perhaps fortunate that yesterday, as I stepped off the diving boat in Scotland at lunchtime, my friend Robert asked if I wanted to go for a pizza with him and some friends afterwards, because it meant I was somewhere with enough of a Wi-Fi connection that I could actually pick up the messages that Tom was not able to join us and put together some thoughts for today. I said to my friends I was having the coffee and the pizza with that perhaps divine inspiration would strike me on the way home, and one of them said, "Well, perhaps this is the pizza of divine inspiration." So I mention that as slight context to the fact I've not been able to put as many of my own thoughts on tolerance into this service as I might have liked. I've certainly got them, and perhaps it's the mark of a good subject that you feel you could go on about it for a lot longer. Don't worry, I'm not going to. But I am going to start with some words from Maud Robinson. Reverend Maud Robinson, who in March 2013 spoke about the event called Time for Reflection at the Scottish Parliament. She commented, "In years gone by, confessing a Unitarian faith could lead you to a sticky end. In 1697, Thomas Aikenhead, a young Edinburgh medical student, rejected the doctrine of the Trinity and for this offence was hanged. It was not until 1813, as we've heard, that the Unitarian Relief Act granted toleration for Unitarian worship, and this year marks its 200th anniversary. Unfortunately, one of many events we've been deprived of as a community this year is our trip to Whitby, which I always enjoy. I mention that because if anyone's ever seen Whitby's Flowergate Chapel, many people actually haven't seen it because it's quite hard to find unless you know where to look. And if you know about Unitarian history, that's characteristic of quite a few of our older buildings. They were deliberately tucked away, or as in Ben's reading earlier, somewhere where you could keep an eye on things, so that if the hand of the law decided to make itself felt and arrest people for dissenting, people could leave swiftly. So Maud Robinson talks about how words evolve and change, but they often continue to carry nuance from the past, which is why it's so important to think deeply about the particular words we use, and certainly no one likes doing that more than Unitarians. The root of the word tolerance carries as one meaning, to experience or undergo as pain or hardship. But are these really the terms in which we wish to view our relationships with those who are different from us? What word could we think of using in its place? Diana, the reading Diana just gave for us now, talks about some of these. Maud suggests that compassion is one of them, calling it a central value and virtue of all the world's faiths. It's a worthy ideal to aspire to, but does it cover the same ground as tolerance? Is it so wide that the initial focus on relations with those who differ from us is lost? If we try to approach those of different beliefs with compassion, we might treat them with kindness as fellow human beings, but does it challenge us to truly engage with them in relation to their differing beliefs and worldviews? And I think that when we talk about tolerance, there can sometimes, I think what Maud is referring to here, and what was more explicit in Diana's reading, is that we start edging up to the notion of judgment. And I think there's been a bit of a reluctance as Unitarians, understandably, to judge other people's beliefs. We remember historically that we ourselves were judged and often have been judged. And then we run into the very thorny question, should we judge some people's beliefs? When we hear something we find abhorrent, how do we respond to it, and especially if it's within our own society and our own community, how do we try to acknowledge the other person's humanity, whilst at the same time acknowledging that we don't stand on the same ground? Maud comments that acceptance might be a good phrase. It doesn't carry the grudging connotations of tolerance, but it can imply an uncritical, wholesale embrace of everything said or done in the name of another cultural or faith tradition. As thinking people, we can't accept actions which emanate from a different worldview if they are harmful to others. This can be a difficult line to walk, but blind acceptance is not the answer. And it's interesting to think about what we mean by actions. I think especially in this time of social media. As many of you know, I'm on social media a lot, possibly too much. How much Mark Zuckerberg knows about me is something I prefer not to contemplate late at night. But there's no denying that in some cases it can be a good thing bringing people together. But sometimes it feels as though we live in a society where people are increasingly shouting past each other. And even if it's simply words on a computer screen, they're not always simply words on the computer screen. Repeated messages of hate and anger aimed at one particular person can be overwhelming, even if no physical harm is done and there's no physical contact. So I suppose I can feel myself edging up to an article on toleration in the social media age, but I won't start writing it here. But I think that is something we have to think about. Sometimes I think as a society, we've created a great chamber in which people repeatedly shout past each other, and the louder we shout, the more we feel we're being heard. And I suppose I love Unitarianism. Perhaps what I hope we can bring is a space where people can be quieter and think and reflect. And Maud suggests that respect is perhaps the word she thinks of last, and perhaps as one of the better solutions, because respect means to value other people. Tolerance avoids engagement, she says, but respect welcomes it. This vision of moving beyond tolerance toward respect and active engagement with difference seems a better aspiration. Respect speaks more of thoughtful consideration. It's more generous than the implications of doing something grudgingly, which can sometimes be understood by tolerance, but it is more thoughtful and constructively critical than careless acceptance. So we have some thoughts there from Reverend Maud Robinson. I enjoyed reading that a lot, and I thought she had some fantastic ideas. I did find myself thinking I don't know, perhaps it's a function of the fact that, I was going to say I'm getting older. The laws of the physics states we're all getting older, that's how time works. My 40th birthday looms up next year, which I'm determined to deny as much as possible, because as far as I'm concerned, I look in the mirror and see someone 20, and I will say that until I'm in a pine box. But perhaps when you have lived for a few decades, you start realising that sometimes the very difficulties we have with toleration, I think, are what can make it a virtue in itself. Sometimes life is just not comfortable. Sometimes I hear someone's views and I think, you are a fellow human being and I acknowledge your humanity, but I fundamentally disagree with everything you said. Yet in an increasingly small world, we must all live ultimately in what is the same space. Our world is one space, and we all depend on the Earth's resources. Sometimes toleration may be a virtue precisely because it allows us to find that compromise. I suppose I'm thinking also of a book I read recently, Left for Dead, by a writer called Lewis Goodall, which I sometimes think would sit nicely alongside Poverty Safari for those of us who've read that, in which he describes his own family. At the end of the Brexit vote, he received a call from his father when the result was announced saying, "This is fantastic, Lewis, the future is going to be brilliant for you." And he was sitting there thinking, "Dad, this is a bit awkward because I've got my girlfriend crying on my shoulder who voted Remain and who now thinks all her dreams have been shattered." Sometimes I find myself in sympathy with Lewis Goodall, sitting between two entirely different worldviews, both seem opposing to the other, and trying to reconcile the two. Andrew Hill, Reverend Andrew Hill, talks a bit more about tolerance in The Unitarian Life, a book I quite strongly recommend if anyone has a chance to read it. He shares two views here. He put together something from a Unitarian called Sarah Tinker, who talks about what toleration meant to her, and I thought it was nice to share one person's reaction to it. She commented, "It was only when I was invited to join an adult religious education course called Building Your Own Theology that I realised how truly tolerant Unitarians can be. Week after week I listened enthralled as we all grappled with our beliefs, our uncertainties, the questions that all our lives had forced us to consider. I met a minister who wasn't sure if God existed. I met people whose faith was strengthened by adversity, and those for whom firm beliefs were no longer of value. I learned that Unitarians, by and large, are spiritual folk who can stand the terror of uncertainty, who can accept that in matters religious and spiritual, we just don't know for sure. When we sit together in such groups, Unitarians are doing far more than just tolerating each other. By truly listening to one another, by creating spaces where we can share one another's stories, hopes and fears, we affirm the right of individuals to express themselves fully and to be heard and accepted for who they are, unique human beings." And finally, I'd just like to conclude with a reading from John Clifford, a former President of the General Assembly. "Tolerance is not an end in itself, but a means towards the development of truth and community. One implication of this is that there are situations where tolerance is not the best attitude. Earl Morse Wilbur, who we've heard about earlier, observed that tolerance was one enduring characteristic with freedom and reason of Unitarianism, and if you visited other Unitarian buildings, they quite often do have freedom, reason and tolerance somewhere prominently displayed within the building. And I think some of the historical context we've seen here shows just how important those values have been in our development. But converting this observation into a defining principle sells us, our religion and our movement short. John Clifford says, "It's helpful to think of tolerance in the context of the values of truth, love and beauty that it serves. These values shape a religious quest, guiding and motivating, but never fully realised. Tolerance, whilst also a means towards community and aesthetics, is most clearly part of the struggle for truth. One reason for its emphasis in Unitarian thinking is our focus on trying to discover and lead our lives in harmony with the truth. In our battles with creeds that attempt to confine the truth, we can easily forget that the love struggle and the beauty struggle are just as important in developing our human and divine potential. There may be times when we cannot be true to higher values and tolerate something. This is perhaps clearest in relation to love. For when we love someone, we cannot tolerate their being exploited. The more deeply and widely we love, the less we can tolerate exploitation, whether we talk about child abuse, racial hatred, or other forms of horrible division within society between those of different beliefs. It is good to be tolerant, but it is better and more purposeful to be loving. Thank you. And now we are reaching the end of our service, and I will now put out our chalice. We have put out the physical flame of the chalice, but its light burns within us until we are able to gather together once more. And as our final prayer, we stand on the shoulders of giants, of the Unitarian and free Christians who gave selflessly for the principles we still hold dear. Let us be worthy heirs to our proud tradition of freedom, reason and tolerance. Let us go from this place in peace and fellowship. May it be so.